In the future of work, the products making our jobs easier are the ones redefining the tedious ways things used to be. Today's guest is an example of that, as his products have been allowing users to work smarter, not harder, for the past 13 years.
You're listening to Found, TechCrunch's podcast that brings you the stories behind the startups. And today we're talking to Howie Liu from Airtable, a low-code platform for building collaborative apps. I'm Becca Skutak, and here to talk about how we can really level up a spreadsheet is my lovely co-host,
Dominic Midori-Davis. And of course, before we get into our conversation, we have our two truths and a lie. And at the end, we'll tell you which one of these statements isn't true. So listen carefully. Is the lie that Howie's first startup was acquired, that Airtable grew through a creative enterprise sales approach, or that Airtable's platform design was inspired by Big Hero 6?
Listeners, you'll have to keep listening to find out. But before we dive into the episode, a reminder to rate and review the show. You can do so wherever you're already listening to this episode, so super easy for you and super helpful for us. But now, without further ado, here's our conversation with Howie. Hey, Howie, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I am doing well. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. Excited to be here.
Perfect. We usually start these conversations off by asking founders to explain a little bit about their company. I'm sure a lot of our listeners already know what Airtable is, but I think we should still start there anyway. Maybe if you want to tell us a little bit about Airtable and what you guys are up to.
Yeah, so when we founded the company almost 12 years ago, the vision was we want to make it really easy for anyone to build really awesome, useful apps, right? And apps for internal company operations. So it could be marketing operations, could be product operations, could be content operations at a media company. We even had fun ones early on. We grew organically from businesses like cattle farming, right? Or small nonprofits. So just really the gamut of different types of apps. Initially, at least, the product really kind of looked like a spreadsheet. So I think we got a lot of use cases that otherwise would have gone into a spreadsheet, but really deserved, a kind of more robust data structure and real interface, real app capabilities. Since then, we've kind of really evolved to focus more and more on bigger, higher scale and kind of more strategic use cases, especially within high growth or high scale companies.
Did you always have an interest in this area? Like, what sparked your idea to launch Airtable in the beginning? What led you to this space?
Yeah, I would say there were two influences. One is, ever since I learned how to program in high school and started building different apps, the idea of like building the meta app always appealed to me. So instead of having to build every app and, at some point, I think back in like 2000, maybe call it 5, 6, Rails came out and made it even easier to build a certain type of like app with like a simple edit interface on top of it. So very easily you could spin up like, hey, here's an app to track our creative assets as a small agency. So I actually did an internship at a company in New York that, had me spend the summer building, one such basically CMS. And as I built these different use cases, I just kept thinking like, what if it was even easier to build this and you didn't have to program at all and anyone could basically get the value of like building an app, right? So I think that was part of it. Just as I built a lot of apps, seeing the commonality across them and, really wanting to make that even easier. The second light bulb for me was, so I had a first startup that was short-lived back in 2010, went through Y Combinator, and long story short, ended up getting acqui-hired by Salesforce. So sold that company to Salesforce, worked there, and I think within Salesforce saw really the power of having a platform. A lot of people think of Salesforce as the CRM product, which it is, but what really made it work well and to scale to all the different unique needs of every company in different industries is the fact that it was completely configurable, right? So underneath it all was this platform that allowed you to make apps. You had a data layer, you had a logic layer, you had an interface layer. And so I think working there, seeing the power of that platform really also set off a second light bulb for me, which is, oh, wow, like there's actually a really great business to be built and a lot of different applications to be built if you can create a platform that really boils down to these basic layers of data layer, logic layer, interface layer. So coming out of Salesforce, was kind of inspired to build a very, very consumer accessible version of this app platform that anyone, without having to be technical, without having to read a manual, could go and use to build useful apps.
Definitely. It's so interesting to hear you say that even before you launched the company, you sort of realized that it would need to be a platform, because that's something I know from chatting with like B2B sales company or B2B SaaS companies, more accurate. It's always interesting to hear about who starts as a feature and then can turn into a platform and who starts and dies as a feature. because platforms are kind of always how you win in certain areas. Of course, not all, but a lot of areas you kind of do have to be a platform to be able to get that meaningful market share.
Totally.
So it's so interesting that you thought of that from the beginning, but of course, building a platform is much harder than starting with one space and expanding from there. So what was it like having that in your mind and kind of going out to tackle that problem right away?
Well, I think a lot of companies are built when you have a certain stubbornness from the founders to kind of resist conventional logic. If building a company was like super easy and obvious, then like everybody would do it, right? I think you have to have both like a little bit of stubbornness, you have to have a little bit of luck, and a lot of hard work. And in our case, I think like our stubbornness about really wanting to build a platform, it was our thing. And we actually did get a lot of pushback and feedback from investors early on. Like we went out and pitched the company even before we had publicly launched. And I think pretty commonly we heard the refrain of like, oh, but you can't build a platform from day one.
Right.
You have to launch a solution. And to your point about like features versus platforms, that's a really good distinction. And I would add a third bucket, which is you've got features, which are kind of like, you start with something very thin and small, maybe like Loom initially, great product, eventually, but like started as more of a feature, right? It was an extension. You could kind of record videos. You could even argue a product, other products started as features, but eventually evolve into products. You've got platforms, which are kind of like, this is a general purpose Lego kit. You can do a lot of things with it. It's kind of use case agnostic. And then you've got what I would call solutions, which are, it's like dedicated to one specific use case, often in one industry. So that could be something like Procore for construction project management. It's like literally just built for construction project management, right? You're not going to do anything else with it,
right.
But it is a complete, robust solution. I think a lot of the feedback we got from investors was more about, okay, it's going to be really hard to build a platform and market a platform. Like you're all things to everyone. You should go and you don't want to build a feature either, but you do want to go and build like a solution, right? Where you're really picking off some smaller kind of market niche. Here's a vertical, here's a use case, and just dominate that. It could be healthcare, electronic, medical records as a system, right? That's one app that you could just focus on building and build a business around it. But we had this belief that what was actually needed in the world was a much more generalizable platform that was just so much easier to use than anything else out there, that it could kind of undercut the barriers and the traditional kind of logic against launching with a platform. Like the reason why platforms are hard typically is because it takes a lot of effort for somebody to then go and build the solution they want on top of it. And so we really believed, fast forward like 10 years and lots of hard work and hundreds of millions of revenue later. And like, I think we kind of made it work in spite of the logic, but we really wanted to just build a product that people could use for a variety of use cases.
What were companies using before something like Airtable existed?
Yeah, great question. I mean, a lot of it was spreadsheets. So, I mean, one thing that I found kind of interesting was that if you went around, and we actually did do this, we like reached out to friends and family and just like people in various roles, like nonprofits to product managers to people in sales. And we kind of just looked at how they were using their current apps and productivity tools. And we found like a lot of people were using spreadsheets as basically an app platform. Like it's super interesting because like spreadsheets, and we were kind of history buffs of tech and software. And so we went back in time and kind of looked at the origins of all these products. Like spreadsheets were kind of invented, VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet product way back in the day in the early 80s. And it was kind of designed for number crunching purely, right? It wasn't meant to be this like workflow database thing where you could put like customers in it or inventory or event lists or whatever. It was really kind of purely meant as an accounting tool. And over the years, it just kind of became, because it was so easy to use, you just click into a cell, you put whatever you want in it, you can kind of lay things out in a tabular way. I think it got like expanded into all of these different more app-like use cases. So the predominant thing we were replacing was spreadsheets. Now, I think interestingly also for us, there were a few database products of yesteryear, like Microsoft Access, FileMaker Pro, there are a few others like this, that actually had like a fair amount of scale. Like, and these products probably had like millions, if not tens of millions of users, at least back in the day. And we found that when we first launched Airtable, we actually tapped into this like big pocket of like people who had been big fans or active users of these products like FileMaker, and said like, oh my gosh, like FileMaker hasn't changed for the past 20 years. This is like the modernized FileMaker that's built on the web, collaborative, and like upgraded, right? I think we got a lot of those customers as well, especially in certain industries like in media entertainment. Like you had a lot of people in actually production. So they'd be like in production operations, post-production, et cetera. And they were actually very avid users of FileMaker still for a lot of those production workflows. So a lot of those folks came over to Airtable and like kind of immediately grokked, oh wow, this is like a modern app platform, database platform that allows me to do all these things that I was doing in FileMaker.
And something I wanted to ask you about, especially because of when you guys got founded and thinking about where we are today, how have you guys been able to kind of adapt as different tech trends have come through? The cloud, AI, people have changed their behaviors since 2013 when it comes to how they do things on their computer, how they do things at work. How have you guys been able to kind of both adapt and ride the changes in consumer and business behavior, but also just the underlying technology that's available as you guys have gotten to the point you're at now?
For sure. So I think our very founding moment was well timed, whether intentional or not. I don't think it's an accident that Airtable and Figma, as an example, were founded around the same time back in 2012, spent about 2.5, 3 years building like pretty robust product offering. Like this was not like a launch overnight, see what sticks kind of a thing. This was like a premeditated, like, let's go and build a really awesome product and basically create like a desktop grade experience, but on the web and using at the time, like the cutting edge of web technologies, like being able to do real-time collaborative experiences with server-side technologies like Node.js, be able to create robust front-end components and interface interactions with React and with kind of the new WebGL capabilities of browsers, and really kind of pushing what you could do on the web to the limits. We were definitely benefiting from like the tech trend of that moment, which is for the first time you could build like truly desktop grade web experiences, right? Like what previously would have required a software download, Microsoft Access, FileMaker, or in Figma's case, like Adobe desktop products. Now you could actually build in the web and it could be instantly collaborative and real time. But I think second of all, we were also kind of riding the wave of that moment, which is, I think for the first time, like maybe it was generational, but people in workplaces started bringing their own tools to work, right? Or started adopting their own tools. And I think like if you rewound the clock 10 years, like that wouldn't really have worked, right? The whole PLG thing, products getting self-served into the enterprise and into like workplaces, I think wouldn't have happened because I think there was much more strict IT policies. I think people were less inclined to do so. So I think we really kind of tapped into both the consumer or the behavioral trends of bring your own product to work and the expectation of like consumer grade experiences for work tools, as well as like kind of the tech trend of like, now we can actually build this much richer web-based collaborative experience. And, I think we've been able to like ride that wave for basically the past decade, right? I think that those trends are still relevant. And I think with a lot of these things, it's not like the trend becomes obsolete. It's almost like it just gets layered with the next thing, which obviously now is AI. But, when I think of that trend that we rode, it was really a layer on top of cloud and cloud computing, which had already been happening for probably 10 years prior to us. And that itself was like a layer on top of like just internet services and products, consumer experiences, period. And that obviously was a layer on top of personal computing, et cetera. And so I think to us, it's like we really got our starting in that foundational moment and built ourselves on that layer of rich web collaborative experiences. And I think now what we're doing is like figuring out really rapidly how to best take advantage of AI to enrich even that product experience. So I think it is pretty game changing for us because as a build anything app platform, AI allows us to actually make it really easy for anyone to come in and just say like, in natural language. So we have a feature called Co-Builder now that allows you to come in and just say whatever app you want by name, and it will literally go and like try to build it for you, right? Use its own reasoning capabilities to figure out like, hey, I'm a VFX coordinator at Netflix. Help me build an app to manage my workflows. And it will go and infer what that app should look like based on its knowledge of Netflix, VFX, and those production workflows. And we're also seeing really interesting use cases pop up as we basically give our builders. So we have this amazing community of people who like go out and build apps with our Lego kit. And we're now giving them maybe the most potent Lego piece ever, which is like the ability to put AI into those apps. So an example would be like we're seeing customers actually take AI capabilities from top LLMs, from OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera, and actually plug them into really interesting workflows that maybe we wouldn't have thought of ourselves. So, hey, it turns out like you can actually go through all of these like earnings calls and like financial data about a, let's say, investment you're considering making. You're a hedge fund, and you can use AI and Airtable to kind of extract out key insights from each one. And that actually saves you like not just minutes of work, but like hours of work, because it takes hours to read through these transcripts and then like derive insights from them. I think that's been the really exciting thing is like, I think a lot of the missing thing in AI is like, what is the right form factor and what is the right way to actually shape AI into a useful form in especially like work that's meaningful and recurring versus more kind of one-off and free form. So that's a lot of where we see the next frontier of innovation happening in our space. It's really exciting.
And I definitely wanted to ask you one question, going back to what you said a little bit earlier about how you guys got popular during the like bring your own tech to work kind of era. I was just talking about that this week with someone, and they were saying the same thing about Slack, about how like that's how Slack was able to get their traction too. And so I'm curious, like, how were you guys selling yourselves then at that time? If it does seem like you were getting a lot of traction from individuals who then went on and led into those larger enterprise contracts. So how were you able to sell in that way? And how did that kind of shape how you guys have sold the product since?
So when we first launched, we didn't actually literally sell the product. And we didn't have any salespeople, right? So it was all organic product-led growth. And the way we like kind of marketed the product, and we didn't really do much paid marketing either, like the vast majority of our growth, our signups was all organic. So people would literally just hear about Airtable, maybe from a friend, maybe they would see a press article about it, maybe a coworker was using it, but they would just kind of hear about it organically and then just come to Airtable, sign up for themselves. And, our real goal was to make it so drop dead easy to start using Airtable and getting value out of Airtable that like in like 30 seconds, instead of us having to pitch you on using Airtable, you could just experience it for yourself, right? And to be honest, like we never really had like a very succinct way of describing fully what is Airtable. We could say like, oh, it's a really easy to use no-code app platform. We could say like, oh, it's a database that anyone can use and you can put data in it and do these workflows, or it's a spreadsheet replacement or so on and so forth. But I actually don't think we ever nailed like the right messaging in the early days. And it kind of was okay because like it was a product that, kind of reminds me of if you ever saw those Apple Jacks commercials back in the day as kids, like it would basically say like, oh, like what are Apple Jacks? And the grown-up would come into the room and be like, what is Apple Jacks? Like, it doesn't even taste like apples. And the kids would be like, oh, you just don't get it, right? Like, if you taste it, if you eat it, if you know, you know. And so I kind of feel like Airtable early on was sort of like that, where it just was such an intuitive product to use that like the best way to describe it was to actually try using it. In that sense, I think we really succeeded in creating a product that through great UX design and being actually useful and robust enough to serve these use cases, it just got like a lot of that organic adoption flywheel going. Fast forward, and as we've kind of moved up into enterprise, I think that's been a natural result of, within larger companies, seeing like pockets of adoption grow and grow and grow. Like we always had this like assumption that early on we would need to be very consumer oriented to get virality. Like you associate consumer with like, consumer companies, like obviously Facebook and Twitter and so on. And they got consumer virality from consumer product. But I think actually in hindsight, like there's this new model of B2B team-centric virality for these SaaS products, right? Slack being a great example, or Dropbox being a great example, where like you almost get more virality within the context of a company, because it kind of makes sense in hindsight, because you have one team using it and then some other team adjacent to them either sees them using it and wants to do it, or like literally needs to connect their use case to the first teams, right? And so we have these internal, like our data team has put together the beautiful mind style like network diagrams of like, here's all the different nodes of adoption within our customers. And within these large enterprises, I mean, it literally looks like this crazy cobweb of connections. And it's just interlinked use cases with others that span almost the entire enterprise, and hundreds or even thousands of teams that each have their own use case, but that's connected to other use cases. So I think we just saw a lot of that organic growth within enterprises. And so over the past, I would say 5-6 years, we've really been building this evolutionary, not revolutionary, enterprise go-to-market motion on top of that core PLG engine, which has allowed us to go in and like work with customers, enterprises, and help them think a little bit more top down about, okay, you have all this organic adoption maybe, but we want to help you think about like how to architect a use case that can span your entire company or in your entire department. So if you want to run all product operations at your company, here's the best way to set that up so it spans the whole org and not just organic teams with it. And that's required, a new muscle and a new kind of way of going to market.
Yeah, and I love the Apple Jacks example. Definitely something I wanted to ask. Like when Airtable first came out, were people like, did they get it immediately, or were they kind of like, what is this?
I mean, it was definitely like Apple Jacks, right? Where like the people who got it were like so over the moon about it. I mean, you could probably go back in Twitter and like look up like some of the organic social mentions that we got at the time, and all of those were like real. I mean, we never asked people to post or anything for us. And I remember seeing some tweets that were like, Airtable is like literally like the best thing since sliced bread. I talk about it so much. Like my partner says it's banned from dinner table conversation because I bring it up every single night. And that's like the level of enthusiasm that people had. Because I think it wasn't just about like being a pretty product or like an easy product to use. It really gives people this empowerment to build. It's not often in today's world where like most products you have are very simplified and you just like participate in it versus getting to be a builder. And people have actually created careers now around becoming like Airtable experts and being like the process architect, the app architect for a really important use case at their company. It was much more of the latter initially, at least, where I would even overhear conversations where like an existing Airtable fan would talk to somebody who hadn't heard of Airtable and they would try to pitch it and they would say, no, but you just have to use it. Or let me show you my use case and that will convince you to do it. But there wasn't like a clear, here's the one liner that perfectly describes what Airtable is. And, I heard the whole gamut of it. I mean, a lot of people called it like a spreadsheet on steroids early on, which, was never a term we condoned. But I think over time, we've started to like build some, I think, like goodwill around certain concepts like no code, the fact that we are this app platform, can scale up to these certain operations really, really well, especially in certain functions like marketing and product and content operations. Within every industry, we're starting to have we have enough customers in each industry that I think there's actually know-how within that industry. So across all of media, like it's known that Airtable can power content production and marketing operations. It's known within a lot of retail companies now that we can power like a lot of parts of the either creative operations process, merchandising operations, or even like digital product operations there. So I think now it's like starting to become known, like both what is Airtable at a more general level, like this platform, but also like what can it be used for in your specific industry context.
And I know I wanted to ask you about the app builder, but before I go there, I have to ask about the design of the platform in terms of like the psychology that went behind, I guess, the design and the layout and how you wanted it to come across to people. Like, what was the inspiration? What was the psychology behind it?
Yeah, so I would say there's two very direct design inspirations. One is actually Legos. So if you think about Legos, they're really colorful. They're fun, obviously, but they're also like educational and like powerful if you want to build something powerful, right? Like the sky's kind of the limit in terms of what you can build. And like, I'm sure we've all seen like the crazy pictures of like some life-size Millennium Falcon that somebody built with Legos, right? So if you look at Airtable today, like it's a very colorful product, right? You can color your different apps. The logo itself is kind of colorful. And partly that's to evoke this sense of like, you get all these like really colorful pieces to build apps of your own creation with Legos. And the second inspiration actually is from this movie, Big Hero 6, which I don't know if you've seen it, but it's like the one with like the puffy Michelin Man looking robot, Baymax. I found it to be like, it came out, I think just a few years before we launched, but I found it to be like a very kind of like sweet idealization of what like tech could look like when really made like human friendly and like, when tech is there to empower humans rather than to like replace human ingenuity. And actually in the movie, there's an evil character who creates these like nanobots that are really evil and they're just kind of like, they can kind of consume the world. And then there's like this big puffy, like kind of likable robot, Baymax, who is like the very human complementary vision of like what tech can look like. It just like the movie touched me in a really deep way. And so we actually like for a while, like if you looked at our actual HTML in Airtable, there was actually a reference to Baymax, which was our kind of like design style system. We still have like rounded corners in some parts of the product, and it's meant to just feel a little more soft, a little bit more approachable versus purely just kind of futuristic and almost intimidating, right? Like we want this to be a product that really is kind of built for human ergonomics because ultimately it's about making humans the builders, the tinkerers who are able to make awesome things versus just try to replace humans with something that's fully automated or so arcane that only very, very specialized technical people can use it.
No, I love that.
Oh, wow. I have not seen Big Hero 6 yet.
Really? Oh, you have to watch it.
Our producer is going crazy in the Slack, though. She really likes that movie. More from this conversation right after a quick break.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to go back and ask about Airtable AI. I always like asking people this question in terms of like building out a product like this. How do you do this? How do you train the data? How do you get enough data to build something like this?
So in our case, we are actually not training with customer data. First of all, these like the generalized foundation models. So OpenAI just released O1. Most recently, like before that, they have GPT-4o. Anthropic has like Claude 3.5 now. And before that, there was like Claude 3. All very potent models. And, of course, you have like Llama 3 from Meta as an open source offering. You got Mistral models. Point being, like, all of these models that are general purpose are getting really, really good. I mean, anyone who goes and tries like ChatGPT or Gemini or Notebook LM is kind of the hot thing in the moment, like can just see for yourself like how good these models are at very generalized reasoning. What we're able to do is basically take the out of the box reasoning capabilities of these LLMs. And like, it's not in our interest or in our strategy to go and like develop our own custom models from scratch. Because at this point in the game, it's best to just ride the wave of these other companies that are spending a lot of money and a lot of effort on making the out of the box general purpose models better and better and better. And instead, really focusing our efforts on what's the data and context for a specific customer, that's scope to that customer, that we prompt the model with. So in the co-builder case where we're using AI to build apps for the customer, we're doing some clever things behind the hood to really give the model the right context. So it's very generally capable, but we can give it additional context about like the use case and how we want it to think about like architecting the app and create tables like this and create interfaces like this that gives it really good results, right? Or that results in really great results. I also think UX and kind of like the human computer interaction matters more than ever. What the world has really seen from the past couple of years of like AI is not good enough to just completely replace humans in the vast majority of substantial tasks, right? And unsupervised AI, if you just have AI go out and like try to solve any problem, it could come up, whether it's coming up with marketing copy or analyzing a financial call, it's not going to do a perfect job when just purely left to its own devices. What does make it work and really valuable is if you have like a frequent degree of human supervision throughout the process, right? So if a human is able to see the AI output and then give it feedback and then have it kind of take another stab at it based on that feedback. And so a lot of what we're doing is also kind of focused on the UX of how do you make the AI outputs very visible, very easily editable by the human so that you create this feedback loop. And over time, you can even make the prompting better for that specific customer because this specific AI use case can learn from the feedback that the human's giving it. So as you're giving it feedback on like, oh, I didn't like this marketing copy, I'm going to use this instead, that can actually go back into kind of a reinforcement loop for this specific model call. Where we see the AI value being unlocked is, take the general purpose models, but then really put your effort into thinking about how to shape the model calls with the right context, data, and human guidance.
Definitely. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about your journey as a founder personally, knowing that, of course, this wasn't your first company. When did you decide it made sense for you to become an entrepreneur? Like, did you always think that'd be something you were going to do? Was that like a big transition for you? Did it seem like an idea came to you, you just had to take it? What was that journey like becoming an entrepreneur? And like, how has it been riding out this wave for you personally?
I did always love the idea of like building things from scratch and starting a business. I remember back in the day, I was probably like 12 or something, and I started using eBay to sell Pokemon cards. And like, even like that act of like going and figuring out how to like create a little mini business, right? And like, how do you market the cards? And then you would get the sale come in and you would figure out how to like package up the cards efficiently and send them out. I really loved that, like build it from scratch, figure out how to like create an end-to-end business and create value in the world, right? Like, by definition, if you're selling something and somebody's willing to pay for it, assuming you're not scamming them, which, like I never wanted to do, you're creating value. you're packaging up, in this case, Pokemon cards, but it could be, I also built like little Pokemon websites, had a big fixation on Pokemon at the time.
Love that.
Who didn't at the time? But, like you're creating value in the world. You could be creating like a fan site that people want to come to and like experience content, learn, and whatever. I just love that feeling of like, wow, like with my bare hands, and without a ton of like existing resources. I didn't come from like a family that had much history of building businesses. We were very financially modest. So coming from like this background where like we kind of have to be scrappy, it was really fun, I found, to like go and make something that just required some ingenuity and some sweat. And so, in high school, like I kind of started learning about like tech and software and realized like I always loved computers. I always loved software and using all the apps that I found on the internet back in like the web 1.0 bubble, right? I was still in high school at the time, but like it was just fun to like see all these different new sites and services. Many of them probably were not the most sustainable business models. They would just send you like basically free stuff without much in exchange. I just found it like really exciting and I wanted to be part of it. And I found that like, oh wow, like if you learn how to program, then even without like any existing investment capital, without any existing like physical products or ingredients, like you can basically build almost any kind of product you want in software just with like time and like ingenuity. And so I think I really enjoyed learning how to program and especially learning how to build web apps because of that. And at the same time, it was still a kind of pretty scary leap to forego like a traditional career path, not take like a real job that would pay real dollars, and instead take a leap to like try the startup thing. And so with my first startup, that was especially daunting, just deciding I had a job lined up that actually my now co-founder, Andrew, helped me get. He basically helped me get an interview at the company he was at. And literally leading up to the day that I was supposed to show up to work, don't recommend this as a career move, but I was so torn with indecision of like, I really wanted to try the startup route, but I also like felt very scared about giving up this like more certain job and career path. And like literally day of, I was still like kind of torn with indecision. And I mean, the morning just kind of started going by and it was like, I don't think I really want to go. I think I do want to make the leap and do the startup thing.
Oh my gosh.
And like a few hours into the day that I was supposed to show up, like I still hadn't told them I wasn't going to show up. And then I got a call from one of their recruiters who was asking like, oh, are you going to come today? Like, are you okay? And in that moment, I kind of made up my mind like, okay, like I'm going to give up this job. I know it's going to look bad. Again, not a recommended move, but like, something in me like in that moment just decided I'm going to make the leap. And it's going to be a lot of risk, right? But decided to go the startup path. Ended up teaming up with somebody I knew from school, different co-founder from Airtable, worked on our first company together, got through Y Combinator. And I think from then on, it became more legitimate, a career path in my mind. Because I think for a lot of folks, including myself, like the first time you get exposed to the startup world is kind of like the most scary and daunting because like it's just such a foreign concept. Like, wait, you're just going to invent your own job? Like, is that really a thing? And I think once you've either gotten some exposure to it or gained some experience around it, it starts to feel more natural. So certainly I've benefited from a lot of luck and help along the way. But like ever since taking that first leap, like for me, I've always felt like this is the right path for how I operate.
Earlier, you were talking about how you guys noticed once you started building the app that like people from like a variety of different industries were building different apps on here. And I gotta know, like, what's the funnest or the craziest app people have built on Airtable? If one comes to mind that you were like, oh, that's so fun. I never thought about that. Like,
yeah,
I'm definitely curious.
Well, this is like less fun and more like really interesting and kind of inspiring, but like a lot of nonprofit relief efforts were kind of built on Airtable. So like after a few different natural disasters, for instance, like the Sonoma fires, like there were just kind of these grassroots organizations that popped up and kind of built their operating system on Airtable, for instance, to like dispatch volunteers to go out to homes to check if everybody was okay or to make sure like pets were rescued. World Central Kitchen, I think, built like a food kind of donation and delivery system for frontline workers on Airtable. So I think those were just really cool to see. Like it was like spinning up like a whole operating system for some of these efforts almost overnight. I always love discovering like surprising nooks and crannies of the world and different businesses through these use cases. Like early on, we had like small mom and pop restaurants in various parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, popping up on Airtable, right? And I would email them, talk to them, and they would be doing something like managing their employee shifts or food inventory and that kind of thing. So really just the exciting part and the fun thing was getting to see almost like a perfect like cross section of like all the different types of businesses out there in the world. That's always been fun.
My favorite question to ask founders is always, while building this company or your first one, do you have any kind of like funny mishap stories of something that maybe like looking back on is funny, but maybe at the moment was not funny at all?
I mean, I think there were a lot of like scary moments, especially in the early days. We spent 2.5 years building this product that, we got little moments of validation along the way. Like we would preview it with different folks. We had like an early alpha that was really rough around the edges, but like we could actually test like the viability of the product with a few users. But I think it was like it was very scary to have spent that much time. And like 2.5 years is a big chunk of your life, right? On something that like when we launched, I mean, obviously we had good conviction and reason to believe it would work, but there was still this like moment of, is this going to work, right? So I think to me, like that lead up to the launch moment, and honestly, if I could do it again, like I think I would have tried to move a little faster with a little bit more urgency. I mean, we were building very quickly as we could during that time. But even if I could have like shaved off a few months in that 2.5 years, like I think I would have pushed even harder to do so. I did once, this is kind of a gross one, but in terms of being very scrappy in the early days, I did once literally plunge the toilets of our bathroom, our shared bathroom, on behalf of an unknown, unnamed, coworker. But it's like these moments where you just kind of like, you do whatever you have to do. And sometimes like being CEO literally means you're also the like, toilet plumber of the business, like you got to do whatever it takes to kind of unblock the business, no pun intended.
Hey, I think we're pretty much right on time. So I'm going to ask you one last little quick question before we wrap. And that's, you guys have been around since 2013. You've raised a ton of venture money. I know every single listener on this podcast is going to hope that I ask this. Should we expect to see any news from you guys on the exit front anytime soon? Should we be scanning for those S1 filings?
Our philosophy is we think this is a really, really big opportunity. And we're not so arrogant to believe like it's guaranteed that we win this space, but we think that like this space is easily large enough. If you think about like app platform and the use cases that we're already serving in companies, like this can easily be like the next Salesforce or ServiceNow size business, like 10 billion plus, 30 billion plus revenue eventually. So our main focus is just like building the best business and the best like kind of path towards that long-term outcome that we can. And I've always said that, like, I think the IPO moment is just that. It's a moment, it's a milestone. I mean, we're at a scale in the hundreds of millions of revenue. We're growing at a healthy clip. Like, we're actually cash flow generating. So we're at a point where, like, we could be a public company, right? Like, we're at the scale that some public companies are. So it's much more, like, to me, a mechanical decision of, like, when does it make sense to go public? Like, will it help us in terms of publicity? Will it help us in terms of, like, customer visibility? And do we even need the capital, which right now we don't? Like we have $1 billion on the balance sheet from all of our past funding rounds, and we're only accumulating cash at this point. So we're really just kind of focused on the breakthrough execution, especially around AI, especially around this transition to like bigger and bigger use cases. We want to be like the operating system for enterprises to run these like really important, especially like modern digital types of use cases, marketing, product, et cetera. So it's really not in the near term plans for us to think about going public. Like for the next year plus, like we are just fully committed to building a great business.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Howie. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you, Becca. Thank you, Dom. And really, really enjoyed chatting with you.
And that was our conversation with Howie. Dom, what was the lie?
The lie was that Airtable grew through a creative enterprise sales approach. It actually grew more so through, I guess, word of mouth or like bringing your tech to work, kind of, I guess. People were just using the product a lot.
No, I think that's so funny because I mentioned this when we were chatting with Howie, but that's a concept. Like I wasn't covering tech then, not to do one of the things we always do on these outros where we talk about how young and spry we are, but I was not covering tech in 2013. And I was just talking about someone recently about how that was such a thing. And that's why so much of the tech tools we use at work today got implemented, like Slack grew the same way, the concept of like bring your own tech to work and then get your company to adopt it. And I'm just so curious like how that would work now. Like, would that even work now? Like, I feel like I go to download what I think is an approved app from our parent company and they're like, you can't do that. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I literally thought I could. Like, it's like, I don't like with how much cybersecurity has advanced and stuff, which on one hand obviously makes sense. Companies want to protect themselves. I get it. But like, can you even scale that way anymore?
Yeah, I'm like thinking like even with Slack, like so you just showing up and convincing your coworkers to join this mysterious group chat, and then you hope the company like just lets you do that. I have no idea. I'm still trying to get a British VPN here. You know, like we can't. Like I have no idea how you just. Yeah, cybersecurity has advanced so much. I don't know. I mean, what are some recent examples of like kind of bringing your own tech to work?
I don't know if there really are any. That's why it's maybe I'm wrong, but. I'm also probably not the person to ask for this because I'm not the kind of person who's going to be like, oh, this tool isn't great. Well, let me find my own and then let me like just embed it into what I'm doing and then whatever. Like I'm always just like, this tool sucks. And then it just ends there. Like I'm never trying to find something better.
Yeah, I can't think of anything. Although I was trying to convince people to get us a company-wide Grammarly subscription. Maybe that's an example.
That would be nice.
That would be nice, right? Maybe that's a soon-to-be example. Maybe.
We're bringing back bring your own tech to work.
We're bringing it back because we need it.
Yeah. But I also thought it's always fun to talk to a company that seems like they legitimately are like having fun with it. It was so fun to hear about how they thought about designing Airtable and how a lot of the stuff they came up with originally has remained, like soft edges and being inspired by like a children's movie and stuff. Like I just love that. I love when people are like, let me bring my personality into this product.
Yeah, that's definitely why I wanted to ask about the design, because it looked really intentional. And I love hearing that Big Hero 6 inspired. I know that I said that I didn't see it, but now I'm trying to think if maybe I secretly have. I took an animation class in college, and I think I actually did see the movie. I think I did.
Honestly, though,
I just have no recollection of it.
That sounds like a super cool class, one. And two, like, I don't know. I just love that because I feel like everyone, and sure, some areas, like, do you need to make, like, a health insurance claims company like fun and flirty? Like, no, your design does not need to be. But like so much stuff like this where it's like this is gonna be a product people are gonna use every day. It's like, why not make it have a little personality at the end of the day, like Slack does? Even though I do love the jokes about how like having a haunted house that just is a house playing the brush knock notification sound on Slack for an hour. So it's like some personality is good, actually.
Yeah, I think the personalization aspect of Airtable really helped it, because before, kind of like what he was saying, it was just like sheets, like these Excel things, like these kind of just sad, boring blocks of just what, like, it was not fun. It wasn't cute. It wasn't trendy. And so I think the personalization aspect of it really, really makes it fun to use.
Yeah. And I feel like maybe that's also why stuff like Slack and Figma got picked up in the way they did, because if you're going to use something that your company is not telling you to use or is already downloaded on your work computer, you're probably going to gravitate more to something like this. That's something that seems fun to use or that has kind of like that extra piece to it. Or at least speaking for myself. If someone was like, here's a prettier expense software and I could somehow use it, I would be like, yes, I will do that instead.
Yeah. I know that people build careers around being an Airtable expert. And I didn't ask, I was afraid to ask, but like, how do they do that and why?
No, stuff like that's so interesting. People who like build these jobs around like other platforms, like in some ways it's like risky. Like I know like the Amazon aggregators weren't doing well or aren't doing well currently because it's like, well, your business is aggregating businesses built on a business that can change the rules whenever it wants. But this, of course, feels a little bit different because just the goals and the intentions of Airtable are just different than, say, Amazon, which is like sell, the highest margins possible. Whereas this is, I think, obviously approaches it differently. But yeah, I would love to meet someone whose like whole job is like building stuff on platforms for other people, not their own platform.
I know. I was just thinking of if I could do that as a nice side hustle. I was like, wait a minute, can I be an Airtable expert?
Hey, maybe you can be.
Maybe I can be.
You took that animation class. Maybe you could be.
I did take that animation class. I did.
The other thing I thought was super interesting that he said was just the platform piece of it. Because I know it's become a big conversation in the B2B world where it's like, no one will buy your product if it's a feature. Like, people want platforms, like things they can build off of, things they can kind of plug and play. And most companies who are just a feature obviously want to be a platform. Like, no one wants to just be like a one node or whatever. But it was interesting to hear him talk about how they were so intentional about the messaging of wanting to be a platform, even when they were pitching investors before they launched. And that investors were kind of like, that's too lofty of a goal. Because in theory, like, they couldn't survive if they didn't take that mindset. So I don't know. That's like just a classic like disconnect of what VCs say versus like how they would actually invest. Because if Airtable probably didn't have that sort of establishment by like a couple of rounds in, they probably would have really struggled to get funding.
Yeah, how would Airtable even have started as a feature?
I don't know. Maybe like focused on one vertical, I guess, but
you would embed it into like something. I don't know. I'm trying to like, it's giving platform. It needed to always be a platform.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe those investors, that messaging was their way of saying no. Like how people always say that, like for me and the PR people, it's always the timing. It's not always the timing.
Also, I love how you were just like, every feature wants to be a platform. Nobody wants to be a feature. And I imagine like
staying power. Well, maybe some companies do want to be a feature.
That's so funny. I imagine like all the features are listening and they're just like, oh my gosh. They're just like, wait, was that me you're talking about?
Yes. If you're in line to feel shade from me, stay in line.
Stay in line.
Found is hosted by myself, TechCrunch senior reporter Becca Skutak, alongside senior reporter Dominic Midori-Davis. Found is produced by Maggie Stamets with editing by Kel. Our illustrator is Bryce Durbin. Found's audience development and social media is managed by Morgan Little, Alyssa Stringer, and Natalie Kreisman. TechCrunch's audio products are managed by Henry Pickavet. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.